Dialogue. Another episode on dialogue, and I hope it's a helpful one. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. Dialogue. I love dialogue. And so I'm trying to talk a little bit more about dialogue because I actually think that I'm good at dialogue. I don't think that I'm good at many things, but I think that I'm good at writing dialogue. I think that my dialogue actually has a bit of a punch to it and people want to read it. I think in most stories, writing points itself toward instances of dialogue within the story, right? We watch movies, we listen to books, we read books because we want that tasty dialogue, those tasty instances of dialogue. And most movies or most books that we like the most, man, that's a good way to say it, right? The things that we like the most are typically stories that have a climax where there is dialogue, where certain words are conveyed, right? What would Lord of the Rings be like? If we want to be really cliche about things, what would Lord of the Rings be like if Sam and Frodo did not have an exchange when they were on their way up Mount Doom, right? There's a lot of different quotes that we love in dialogue, and they're usually the things we remember most from books or movies or whatever. We just love quotes from our favorite books, don't we? Such as, did you put your name in the goblet of fire? Or, I like the cinema's way of doing it. Did you put your name in the goblet of fire? Etc. There's a lot of instances of good dialogue that people remember. And it's often the case that we quote specific characters in books because we like that dialogue so much. It's kind of an interesting little feature of humans that we like talking so much, and that talking connects to us in such a way that the things that are usually the most memorable in books are specific ways people are talking. But we do run into a lot of dialogue that has no punch. We do run into a lot of dialogue that is boring, or a lot of dialogue that's just not memorable. And I'm not going to be bashing specific dialogue from specific things I don't like or I think weren't done very well. I'm actually going to be talking about a way that I think you can use this strategy and you can write dialogue in this way, and it will actually make your dialogue a lot more interesting. And to a certain degree, I use this depending on the situation. I don't use this strategy always, but depending on the situation, I pull it out, I polish it off, I try it out, I see what happens, etc. But I think that it can be really powerful for a lot of people, and I think it can be really powerful to not only make your dialogue interesting, but direct your dialogue in different ways that you haven't thought before, right? If you have a character who says, oh, are you going to the store? And then you have a character who says, yes, I'm going to the store. That's not interesting dialogue. And the reason why it's not interesting dialogue is people typically don't work that way. People are a lot more complex than even what they're saying. If they are actually having that exchange, people are a lot more complex. And in our dialogue, in creative writing, we're trying to convey the complexity of those people. So I don't think that this piece of advice I'm going to tell you is the only way to write dialogue. I try my best to understand writing, but I don't claim to ever have all the answers about it. But I think this strategy is a worthwhile strategy to implement. And I think that it can help you write more interesting dialogue. I definitely think that is the case. So in the past, I've talked about this idea of writing each person within dialogue with a specific perspective. And I think that it is the case we need to have our writing reflect that fact as much as possible. So what I talked about before is you're trying to get into the mind of each character, and each character is going to be talking and responding to what's said in the dialogue. So the main character has a specific thought. That thought generates dialogue. The other character takes in that dialogue. They're already thinking about something. They think about what the main character said, and they generate their own dialogue that is somewhat based off of what the main character said, but it's also twisted and different because they've got their own things going on as well, okay? And I think that's a really good strategy. And I think that the strategy I'm going to share works hand in glove with that idea as well. So the strategy is characters having two different conversations. What does this mean exactly? That's the question. Well, I think that there's a perfect example between husband and wife, right? You write two characters and you have a husband and wife and they're trying to communicate, but they're just not communicating. They're failing. They just can't get across to each other what they're trying to say. And the reason why they can't get across to each other what they're trying to say is because they're not actually having the same conversation. And it doesn't have to be a humorous interaction, though it can be a humorous interaction. And it is often the case within comedies that humorous interactions are created using this specific strategy. So if you are taking a husband and wife, you're taking two spouses, and you have a fight between these two spouses, you could have the wife talking about how she doesn't feel heard, or you could have, it doesn't really matter which one is talking about that. You could have her thinking about that specific idea and trying to convey to her husband as best she can that she is not being heard, right? And then you could have the husband trying to convey that he is stressed out, and he will do it. He will do what she asks, but he has tons of other things to do as well. And these are similar things that the two are talking about, but they are not the exact same thing, and they are going to be talking past each other. And if you walk a person through the frustration of not being heard, you're probably not going to start out with the person saying, I just don't feel heard by you. You might do that, but you probably aren't. You're probably going to start them out trying to explain themselves to their spouse. And then you're going to have the husband trying to explain himself to his wife as well, right? And what happens in this situation is you have two characters who have their own ideas going on. Like I said, each character is a character. They're thinking their own thoughts. They're trying to convey to the other person what they're saying, but they don't think that the other person is talking about something else, right? This is the whole point of this strategy. When you have these two characters talk, they think that the other person is having the same conversation with them, and they are basing how they talk off that conversation. What kind of conversation would that bring about? And I think it would bring about a much more interesting conversation than if we didn't bring in this idea that the characters have two different things going on. There's two different brains. They have different problems. They have different hopes and dreams. They're just different people. Therefore, they're going to talk differently about the same thing, and they might not even be talking about the same thing ahead of time. And you can apply this in so many different ways. Like I said, you can do it in a humorous way. You can have someone who is speaking, who speaks another language, and they have two languages that they know, but they don't know a specific language well. So they assume certain things about what the person says, but it completely goes beyond them because they just don't have a grasp of the language enough. You could have two people fighting. You could have two people having a great time together. You know, it doesn't have to be two people in conflict. It can be two people enjoying a fantastic evening. Imagine a couple sitting, they're down by a dock, and they're both talking about what is happening in their lives, and they're just like, man, I'm so thankful for what is happening in my life. I'm so thankful for this and that, etc. But at the same time, they're actually thinking about two different things. The conversation shows that there is thankfulness, there is peace, but they're approaching it because of two different ways. One person maybe has had a few issues within their lives. They haven't had a hard life, so they are enjoying it in a way that is different than the other person who has had a very hard life, and that person is much more grateful, if that makes a lot of sense. So last thing I'd like to say is that this is not my original idea, but I think it's useful enough to pass it along to other people. I really don't know whose original idea it is. You can feel free to tell me that in the comments below if you want. But what do you think? Do you think you'll implement this? Do you think it's a good idea? What are your other ways of writing dialogue that work? What are your other ways of writing dialogue that really that make that dialogue great. And that's really the question. That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to write great stories. And I think the pinnacle of those stories, it's oftentimes the dialogue. If you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support me, there's really one simple thing you can do. You can go to danielpoppie.com/newsletter and sign up for my newsletter. And when you sign up, you'll actually be able to get access to my publication roadmap. So that's everything I have planned for pretty much every project I have into the next decade. Again, that is danielpoppie.com/newsletter. You can also find the link below.